The envelope with the Pinecrest Meadows Homeowners Association logo arrived on a Tuesday morning, and I knew before opening it that my peaceful winter would be shattered. I stood at my kitchen window in my home in Boulder, Colorado, holding what turned out to be a $200 fine for unsightly disturbance of snow coverage and creating an aesthetically displeasing appearance visible from the street. I read the words 3 times before my brain processed them. They were fining me for walking through my own front yard, for footprints, in snow, on my property. My name is Connor Yates, and I had lived in this neighborhood for 5 years without major incident. Sure, there were the usual HOA quirks about mailbox colors and the exact shade of beige allowed on homes, but nothing had prepared me for this level of absurdity. I looked out at my front yard where a light dusting of snow from last night had fallen, maybe 3 inches at most. My footprints from retrieving the mail and taking out the trash created a small path from my front door to the driveway and mailbox. Apparently, this was a crime worthy of a fine. The letter was signed by Patricia Hendricks, HOA board president, a woman I had unfortunately encountered multiple times over the years. She was in her late 40s with that particular haircut that seemed to be a requirement for people who enjoyed making others miserable, the kind that demanded to speak to managers at every opportunity. She drove a white SUV with a custom license plate that read Rolls Rock, which I assumed meant Rules Rock, though it looked more like a dyslexic cry for help. I called my neighbor, Marcus, who lived 2 houses down. He answered on the 3rd ring. "You get one too?" He asked before I could say anything. $200 for footprints, I said. "This is insane. Mine is $150. Apparently my dog made an unapproved pathway when I let him out to pee. I am not kidding." They cited Section 12.7 of the CC and Articles about maintaining uniform snow coverage for aesthetic purposes. That cannot possibly be real. Oh, it is real. I looked it up. There is a provision about maintaining the natural appearance of snow and ice on properties during winter months. I always thought it meant we could not put up those tacky inflatable snowmen or whatever, but Patricia is interpreting it as we cannot walk through our own yards. I rubbed my temples. So what? We are supposed to teleport, hover over our lawns. I guess she expects us to only use the driveways and sidewalks, no stepping on snow at all. She sent out an email blast last week about it, but I thought it was just her usual nonsense. Didn't think she would actually fine people. After hanging up with Marcus, I pulled up the email I had apparently ignored. Sure enough, there was a message from Patricia dated the previous Thursday with the subject line, "Important Winter Property Standards Reminder." I opened it and felt my blood pressure rising with every word. The email outlined her interpretation that all snow on properties must remain pristine and undisturbed, except for approved pathways, which apparently meant only driveways and front walkways made of concrete or pavement. Any footprints in snow-covered grass or decorative areas were considered violations. She even included photos of various yards in the neighborhood with footprints circled in red like crime scene evidence. One of the photos was my yard from 2 days ago, when I had walked across to check my outdoor spigot after the temperature dropped below freezing. I forwarded the email to my friend Derek, who was a lawyer, though he specialized in corporate law rather than HOA disputes. He called me back within an hour. "This is the most ridiculous thing I have read all week, and I spent yesterday reviewing a contract dispute about cryptocurrency investments in NFTs of pictures of bridges," Derek said. "But unfortunately, HOAs have pretty broad authority to interpret their own rules. The question is whether this interpretation is reasonable." How is it reasonable to fine someone for walking in their own yard? It is not, which is why you might have a case. But fighting it will cost more than $200 in legal fees. These HOAs bank on people just paying rather than fighting back. So I am supposed to just accept this? No, I am saying you need to be strategic. Document everything. Attend the next board meeting. File a formal dispute. And maybe check if other people are willing to band together. There is strength in numbers. I spent the rest of that day stewing in frustration and researching HOA law in Colorado. What I discovered was both enlightening and infuriating. While HOAs did have significant power, they were also required to follow their own rules and apply them consistently. Selective enforcement was a valid defense, and fines had to be reasonable and directly related to actual harm or violations. The next morning, I decided to pay Patricia a visit. She lived in the largest house in the development, a sprawling two-story with columns that seemed desperately out of place among the mountain contemporary style of most homes in Boulder. I rang her doorbell at 9 in the morning. She opened the door wearing yoga pants and a fleece jacket with the HOA logo embroidered on it. I did not even know HOA logo fleece jackets existed, but of course Patricia had one. "Connor," she said, her voice dripping with false pleasantness. "What can I do for you?" "You can explain why I am being fined $200 for walking in my own yard. It is all in the email I sent. We need to maintain standards in this community. When people see footprints all over yards, it looks messy and unkempt. It lowers property values. It is snow. It melts. And everyone walks in their yard sometimes. Are you going to fine everyone every time it snows?" She smiled, and it was the smile of someone who enjoyed having power over others. "I am fining people who violate the clearly stated standards." If you had read the CC and Articus carefully when you purchased your home, you would know that aesthetic standards apply year-round, including winter. This interpretation is absurd. You are saying no one can walk on their own grass if there is snow on it. You can walk on approved pathways. Your driveway, your front walkway, those are acceptable. But trampling through snow-covered decorative areas creates an eyesore. My front yard is not a decorative area. It is just grass. All yards in Pinecrest Meadows are considered part of the overall aesthetic presentation of the community. Really, Connor, this is not difficult to understand. Follow the rules or pay the fines. Those are your options. I felt my jaw clench. I am filing a formal dispute. That is your right. The next board meeting is in 2 weeks. You can present your case then. Have a good day. She closed the door before I could respond. I walked back to my house, my footprints in the fresh snow from this morning creating a direct path across my front yard. Out of spite, I walked a more elaborate route back, making sure to create plenty of additional footprints. Over the next few days, I connected with other neighbors who had received similar fines. It turned out Patricia had sent out 17 fines in total, ranging from $100 to $300 depending on the severity of the footprint violations. Marcus and I organized a meeting at his house with everyone who wanted to fight back. 8 people showed up, which felt simultaneously encouraging and depressing. Only 8 out of 17 were willing to even try to contest this nonsense. "I talked to a lawyer," said Jennifer, who lived on Oakmont Circle. "She said our best bet is to argue selective enforcement and unreasonable interpretation of the CC and Articus. We need to document that Patricia is applying this rule inconsistently, or that it is impossible to comply with." "She has not fined herself, I can tell you that," Marcus said. "I drove by her house this morning. Her yard has footprints all over it from where she walks to her trash cans. This sparked an idea. We should document that. Take photos with timestamps." If she is not following her own interpretation of the rules, that is selective enforcement. We spent the next week gathering evidence. I drove through the neighborhood after every snowfall, photographing yards. What we discovered was illuminating. Patricia's house showed footprints regularly. So did the homes of two other board members, Deborah Sanders and Frank Portman. Meanwhile, regular homeowners were getting fined for the exact same thing. I compiled everything into a detailed presentation for the board meeting. Photos, dates, times, measurements. I even found social media posts from Patricia showing her walking through her snow-covered yard to take pictures of her garden gnomes, posted just 3 days before she sent out the first round of fines. The board meeting was held in the community center on a Thursday evening. I arrived early with Marcus and Jennifer. The room slowly filled with residents, many of whom had come specifically to hear about the footprint fine controversy. Patricia sat at the front table with Deborah and Frank flanking her. Two other board members, whose names I could never remember, sat at the edges looking uncomfortable. Patricia called the meeting to order with a sharp rap of her gavel, which seemed like overkill for a neighborhood HOA meeting, but that was Patricia for you. We slogged through standard business for 45 minutes. Budget reports, landscape maintenance contracts, discussion about replacing the community mailbox clusters. Finally, we reached the dispute section of the agenda. We have several formal disputes regarding recent fines for winter aesthetic violations, Patricia said, her voice bored as if this was a trivial matter. Connor Yates has requested to speak on behalf of the disputing homeowners. I stood and walked to the front, setting up my laptop to display my presentation on the projector screen. Thank you. I am here tonight to contest the fines issued for footprints in snow, which I believe represent an unreasonable interpretation of our CC and Articus and selective enforcement of community standards. I clicked through my presentation, showing the language of the actual covenant rule, which mentioned maintaining natural appearance during winter conditions in the context of a section about not installing permanent modifications without approval. I argued that this was clearly intended to prevent people from installing heated driveways or elaborate ice sculptures, not to prohibit walking in one's own yard. Then I showed the photos. Patricia's yard with footprints, Deborah's yard with footprints, Frank's yard with footprints. All time-stamped, all from dates when regular homeowners had been fined for identical situations. This is selective enforcement, I said clearly. Board members are violating the same interpretation of the rule that they are fining homeowners for. That is not fair, it is not reasonable, and it is not legal. The room erupted in murmurs and whispers. I saw several people nodding emphatically. Patricia's face had gone red. Those photos are taken out of context. Board members must walk through their yards to conduct property inspections. Property inspections of your own garden gnomes. I pulled up her social media post on the screen. This was posted on your public Facebook page. You are not conducting inspections. You are walking in your yard just like everyone else does. This is harassment, Patricia snapped. You are taking photos of board members' private property from public streets, which is completely legal, and it is not harassment to document selective enforcement of HOA rules. It is evidence. Frank shifted uncomfortably in his seat. Maybe we should reconsider the interpretation of this rule. I did not realize when we approved these fines that it would cause this much controversy. We voted on it, Patricia said sharply. The decision stands. Actually, Jennifer stood up from the audience. I pulled the minutes from last month's board meeting. There was no vote on winter snow standards. Patricia issued these fines unilaterally as president without board approval. Now even Deborah looked surprised. "Patricia, is that true?" "I have discretionary authority as president to enforce standards," Patricia said, but her voice had lost some of its confidence. "For emergencies and clear violations," Frank said, looking at a copy of the bylaws. "New interpretations of rules are supposed to go through a board vote. That is in Article 5. The meeting devolved into chaos. Board members argued with each other. Homeowners shouted questions and complaints. Patricia tried to regain control by banging her gavel repeatedly, but no one was listening anymore. Finally, after 20 minutes of disorder, Frank made a motion to rescind all fines related to footprints in snow and to table any further discussion of winter aesthetic standards until the board could properly review and vote on clear, specific guidelines. One of the other board members, a quiet woman named Helen, seconded it immediately. Patricia looked like she had swallowed a lemon. "All in favor?" 4 hands went up. Only Patricia voted against. The fines were rescinded. I should have felt victorious. I did for about 12 hours. Then the next letter arrived. This time I was being fined $500 for harassment of board members and unauthorized surveillance of private property. The letter cited my photographing of Patricia's house as evidence. I called Derek again. "She cannot do this, right?" "Technically, no. You were exercising your rights to document evidence for a legitimate dispute. But she can fine you, and then you have to go through the dispute process again. She is retaliating, which is actually a bigger legal problem for her than the original fines, but it is going to be a headache for you. So what do I do? File another dispute. Document this as retaliation. And honestly, Connor, you might want to consider getting a lawyer involved formally. This woman is not going to stop." He was right, but I did not want to spend thousands of dollars on legal fees. There had to be another way to make Patricia back down and expose how ridiculous this entire situation had become. That is when the idea hit me. It was late at night. I was looking out at my front yard where another few inches of snow had fallen that evening, and I thought about Patricia's obsession with how things looked from the street. She cared so much about appearances, about aesthetics, about what the neighborhood looked like to outsiders. What if I gave her something really worth looking at? I spent the next day planning. The weather forecast showed a significant snowstorm coming in over the weekend, with predictions of 8 to 12 inches. Perfect. I sketched out designs, measured my yard, and calculated the spacing I would need. The snow started Friday evening and continued through Saturday afternoon. By Sunday morning, my front yard was covered in nearly 10 inches of pristine, undisturbed white snow. It was perfect. I bundled up in my warmest clothes, laced up my boots, and headed outside with a long pole I had prepared. I had tied a bright red flag to the end so I could see where I had already walked. Then I started creating my masterpiece. Walking through snow in specific patterns is harder than it sounds. I had to be deliberate with every step, making sure my path was clear and the letters would be readable from the street. It took me almost 3 hours in the freezing cold, but when I finished and walked across the street to look at my handiwork, I felt a surge of satisfaction. In giant letters spread across my entire front yard, my footprints spelled out. HOA fines for footprints. Board breaks own rules. President retaliation. It was legible, it was dramatic, and it was completely made of footprints in my own snow. If Patricia wanted to fine me for walking in my yard, she was going to have to fine me for this. And everyone who drove past my house would see exactly what kind of HOA we had running our neighborhood. I went inside, made myself hot chocolate, and waited. It took about 40 minutes. My doorbell rang with the kind of aggressive urgency that could only be Patricia. I took my time walking to the door and opened it with my most innocent expression. "What is that?" she demanded, pointing at my yard. "Footprints," I said calmly. "In my snow." "You wrote accusations about the board in your yard. That is vandalism. That is libel. That is. It is footprints," I repeated. "In snow, on my property. I believe you have been very clear that I am allowed to have footprints in my snow, considering you rescinded those fines. You are making the neighborhood look terrible. This is exactly the kind of thing our standards are meant to prevent. Really. Because I thought the standards were about maintaining a nice appearance. This is just me exercising my right to walk in my yard. It is not my fault if the path I chose to walk happens to form words." Her face was approaching a dangerous shade of purple. "This is a deliberate provocation." "No, a deliberate provocation was you fining me $500 for documenting your selective enforcement of rules. This is just me going for a walk, a very specific, carefully planned walk. I am calling an emergency board meeting. We will have this removed. It is snow, on my property. You cannot make me shovel my own yard. That is not in the CC and Articus anywhere." She stormed off, and I closed the door, grinning. Within an hour, people started driving by slowly to look. By evening, neighbors were walking past to take photos. Someone posted it on the local Facebook group for Boulder neighborhoods, and it went viral within the community. By Monday morning, it had spread to the broader Boulder social media community. A local news blog picked it up by Monday afternoon. The article was titled, "Boulder HOA Battle Gets Literal. Homeowner Writes Protest Message in Snow." It included photos of my yard and interviewed several neighbors about the footprint fine controversy. Patricia was quoted denying any wrongdoing, but the comments section was overwhelmingly on my side. Tuesday morning, a reporter from a Denver television station called me. They wanted to do a story about HOA overreach and thought my snow message was a perfect example. I agreed to an interview. The segment aired Wednesday evening. They showed my yard, interviewed me about the original fines and the retaliation, and even got comments from other neighbors about Patricia's management style. The reporter also spoke with an HOA law expert who said that fining people for walking in their yards was one of the most excessive examples of HOA overreach he had encountered, and that the retaliation fine was clearly inappropriate. The story got picked up by the national news. By Thursday, my snow message was showing up on social media across the country. News websites ran articles about HOA horror stories, using mine as the lead example. I got emails from people around the country sharing their own HOA nightmares. Patricia, predictably, did not handle the attention well. She sent out an email to the entire neighborhood condemning me for bringing negative attention to Pinecrest Meadows and causing reputational damage to the community. She scheduled another emergency board meeting for Friday evening. I showed up with Marcus and Jennifer again, but this time the community center was packed. Every seat was filled and people lined the walls. Several residents I had never seen at a meeting before were there, and the energy in the room was electric. Patricia tried to start the meeting with regular business, but Frank interrupted her. "We need to address this situation first. The community deserves answers about what is happening with the board." Patricia's lips pressed into a thin line. "Fine. Connor Yates has deliberately created a spectacle to embarrass this board and this community. His actions are inappropriate and violate multiple standards of conduct." "What standards?" someone called from the audience. "The standards of being a respectful member of this community," Patricia snapped. "The only disrespect I have seen is from you," Jennifer said, standing. "You fined 17 people for walking in their yards. You applied rules selectively, fining regular homeowners while ignoring the same behavior from board members. When Connor documented that selective enforcement, you retaliated with another baseless fine. And now you are upset that he found a creative way to protest your overreach. Exactly, Marcus added. This is not about Connor causing problems. This is about you abusing your authority as board president. The room erupted in agreement. Multiple people started talking at once, sharing their own stories of Patricia's arbitrary enforcement of rules and imperious attitude. One woman talked about being fined for having the wrong shade of white on her window trim. A man described getting threatening letters about his mailbox being a quarter-inch too tall. Another family had been fined because their kid left a bicycle on their front lawn for one afternoon. It went on for almost an hour. Patricia tried repeatedly to shut down the discussion, but Frank and Helen kept yielding the floor to different homeowners. It became clear that the footprint fines were not an isolated incident, but part of a pattern of Patricia using her position to harass residents over minor or imaginary infractions. Finally, Frank stood and addressed Patricia directly. I move that we hold a vote of no confidence in your leadership as board president. You have consistently overstepped your authority, applied rules unfairly, and created a hostile environment for homeowners. This board needs new leadership. You cannot do that, Patricia said, but her voice wavered. Actually, I can. It is in the bylaws, Article 8, Section 3. Any board member can call for a vote of no confidence if seconded by another board member. All homeowners present at a properly noticed meeting can vote. Helen stood. I second the motion. Patricia looked around desperately at the other board members, but none of them met her eyes. This is a coup. You are all going to regret this. All those in favor of removing Patricia Hendricks as board president, raise your hands, Frank said. A forest of hands went up. I looked around the room and could not see a single person not raising their hand except Patricia herself. The motion passes. Patricia, you are removed as president effective immediately. You will remain on the board as a regular member, but you no longer have any special authority. Patricia stood up so fast her chair fell backward. This is illegal. I will sue every single one of you. You can try, Frank said calmly, but everything we did tonight followed proper procedure. Now please sit down so we can continue with business. Patricia grabbed her papers, stuffed them into her bag, and stormed out of the community center. The room broke into applause. Frank was elected as the new board president that night. One of his first acts was to formally rescind my retaliation fine. His second was to propose a complete review of all fines issued in the past year to check for other cases of selective enforcement or unreasonable interpretation of rules. The board voted unanimously in favor. I thought that would be the end of it. Patricia had been stripped of her power. The fines were gone, and the neighborhood could go back to normal. But I had underestimated her capacity for vindictiveness. The following Tuesday, I received a notice that a lawsuit had been filed against me in Boulder County Court. Patricia was suing me for defamation, claiming that my snow message and subsequent media interviews had damaged her reputation and caused her emotional distress. She was seeking $50,000 in damages. I immediately called Derek. She is actually suing me. I saw. She filed it yesterday. I already talked to a colleague who handles defamation cases. The good news is this lawsuit is completely frivolous and will almost certainly be dismissed. The bad news is you still have to respond to it, which means legal fees. How much are we talking? Could be a few thousand just to get it dismissed, more if she fights it. I can refer you to Sarah Nichols. She is excellent with these kinds of cases and might be willing to work with you on fees given the circumstances. I met with Sarah that Thursday. She was in her 30s, sharply dressed and radiated competence. She reviewed the lawsuit and actually laughed out loud at several points. "This is one of the worst defamation claims I have ever seen," she said. "First, truth is an absolute defense to defamation. Everything you said in your snow message and interviews was factual. She did fine people for footprints, the board did break their own rules, and she did issue a retaliation fine. Second, she is a public figure in the context of the HOA, which means she has a higher burden to prove defamation. Third, your snow message is clearly protected speech. You are engaging in protest on your own property about a matter of public concern in your community. So you think it will get dismissed? I think we can probably get it dismissed on a motion, but I want to do something else too. Colorado has an anti-SLAPP statute. That is strategic lawsuit against public participation. It is designed to protect people from frivolous lawsuits intended to silence them. If we successfully invoke the anti-SLAPP law, Patricia will have to pay your attorney fees. So she would end up paying for her own lawsuit against me. Exactly. It is designed to deter people from filing these kinds of retaliatory lawsuits. And based on everything you have told me, this is clearly retaliation for you exercising your rights. Sarah filed our response, including a motion to dismiss and an anti-SLAPP motion. She also sent a letter to Patricia's attorney laying out exactly why the lawsuit was meritless and suggesting they withdraw it before incurring additional costs. Patricia's attorney, apparently, was either incompetent or had not fully understood what kind of case he had taken on. He filed a response opposing our motions that mostly just restated Patricia's hurt feelings and insisted that my actions were mean-spirited. The hearing was scheduled for late February. In the meantime, my snow message had long since melted, but the story continued circulating online. I did a podcast interview about HOA overreach that got significant downloads. A YouTuber who focused on property rights issues did a video about my case that went mildly viral. I even got contacted by a producer working on a documentary about HOAs in America. Through all of this, I continued living my life in Pinecrest Meadows. Frank proved to be a vastly better board president than Patricia. He organized a series of community meetings to review and update the CC and RTCS, removing outdated or overly restrictive provisions. The footprint fine rule interpretation was officially abandoned. Several other arbitrary rules about paint colors and lawn decorations were relaxed. Patricia, meanwhile, became increasingly isolated. She still attended board meetings but rarely spoke. When she did, other board members politely listened and then ignored her suggestions. She stopped attending community events. Her house, previously immaculate, started looking slightly unkempt. I almost felt bad for her until I remembered the $50,000 lawsuit she had filed against me for walking in my yard. The hearing in late February was anticlimactic. Sarah presented our arguments clearly and efficiently. Patricia's attorney stumbled through his responses, unable to identify any factually false statements I had made or explain how my actions constituted defamation rather than protected protest speech. The judge, a middle-aged woman with reading glasses perched on her nose, listened to both sides and then delivered her ruling from the bench. This lawsuit is without merit. The defendant's statements were factual, based on documented evidence, and constitute protected speech on a matter of public concern within his community. The plaintiff, as an HOA board president, was a public figure in that context and has failed to meet her burden of proof. The case is dismissed. Then she turned to Patricia's attorney. Furthermore, This appears to be a clear example of a SLAPP suit intended to silence legitimate criticism. Under Colorado statute, I am awarding attorney fees to the defendant. The plaintiff will be responsible for all reasonable legal costs incurred in defending this action. Sarah squeezed my arm to keep me from reacting visibly, but inside I was celebrating. Not only had I won, but Patricia was going to have to pay for it. Over the next month, Sarah submitted a detailed accounting of her hours and costs. The total came to $8,300. Patricia's attorney filed an objection claiming the fees were excessive, but the judge approved the full amount. Patricia was ordered to pay within 60 days. I never found out if she actually paid or if Sarah had to pursue collection, because something else happened that changed everything. In early April, Frank called an emergency board meeting. I attended out of curiosity, wondering what could constitute an emergency in the post-Patricia era of reasonable HOA management. When Frank opened the meeting, he looked shaken. "I received a call this morning from the Boulder County District Attorney's office," he said. "They are opening an investigation into potential financial irregularities with the HOA accounts during Patricia's tenure as president." The room went silent. Frank continued, "Apparently, an audit of our books revealed several discrepancies. Money that was collected for specific purposes, like our reserve fund for road repairs and the community center maintenance fund, appears to be missing. We are talking about approximately $75,000 that cannot be accounted for." Someone gasped. Someone else said, "Oh my God." The DA's office is treating this as a potential embezzlement case. They are asking for all board members during the relevant time period to cooperate with their investigation. They specifically mentioned Patricia's name as the primary person of interest. I sat back in my chair, stunned. The footprint finds suddenly made more sense. Patricia had not just been on a power trip. She had been trying to collect money to cover up missing funds. All those arbitrary fines, the aggressive enforcement, the constant threats of legal action, it was all about bringing money into the HOA to hide her theft. The investigation moved quickly once it started. A forensic accountant reviewed 5 years of HOA financial records. What they discovered was a systematic pattern of Patricia siphoning money from various HOA accounts. She had started small, a few $100s here and there for administrative expenses that were actually personal purchases. But over time, it escalated. She created fake vendor invoices for services that were never performed. She approved payments to shell companies she had set up herself. She even charged the HOA for supplies and equipment that she then kept or resold for personal profit. The total amount embezzled was eventually calculated at $93,000 over 4 years. In June, Patricia was arrested. I was not there, but Marcus witnessed it and called me immediately. They just put her in handcuffs in her driveway. There are 2 police cars and some people with badges taking boxes out of her house. The charges were filed a week later. 7 counts of theft, 4 counts of forgery for the fake invoices, and 2 counts of computer crime for falsifying electronic records. The district attorney held a press conference, and the case made local news again. This time, I did not do any interviews. This was not about me anymore. This was serious criminal behavior that had victimized everyone in the community. Every homeowner had been paying dues that Patricia was stealing. We had all been funding her lifestyle while she was simultaneously harassing us about footprints in snow. The case went through the legal system over the summer and fall. Patricia's attorney tried to negotiate a plea deal, but the DA was not interested in being lenient. The evidence was overwhelming. Bank records, emails, forged documents. It all pointed clearly to years of deliberate theft. The trial began in November. I attended the first day out of curiosity. Patricia looked diminished somehow, smaller than I remembered. She kept her eyes down as the prosecutor laid out the charges and described the evidence. The trial lasted 2 weeks. Multiple board members testified about how Patricia had controlled the finances and resisted transparency. The forensic accountant walked the jury through the complex scheme of fake vendors and falsified records. Patricia's own emails were shown, demonstrating she knew exactly what she was doing. The defense tried to argue that Patricia had simply been disorganized and bad at bookkeeping, but the evidence of intentional deception was too clear. The fake companies were registered to her address. The forged invoices matched templates found on her computer. Money from HOA accounts had been transferred to her personal accounts before being spent on personal expenses like vacations, jewelry, and car payments. The jury deliberated for 6 hours and found her guilty on all counts. At sentencing in December, the judge was harsh. You were entrusted with your neighbor's money and their confidence. You were supposed to serve your community, but instead, you stole from it systematically and deliberately. And when people questioned your authority, you harassed them with frivolous fines and lawsuits to maintain control and deflect scrutiny. This represents a profound betrayal of trust. Patricia was sentenced to 7 years in prison and ordered to pay full restitution of $93,000 plus fees and penalties. With her criminal record, she would likely lose her house trying to pay it back. I sat in the courtroom gallery as the sentence was read. Patricia's hands were shaking. She had to be escorted out by bailiffs, and I watched as the woman who had once wielded so much power over our neighborhood was led away in handcuffs. Afterward, Frank organized a community meeting to discuss the path forward. The board had already hired a new management company to handle HOA finances with proper oversight and transparency. All financial records would be available online for any homeowner to review. The board also voted to eliminate most of the arbitrary rules that Patricia had used to harass residents. We want this to be a real community again, Frank said. Not a place where people live in fear of petty fines or vindictive enforcement. The HOA should exist to maintain common areas and help neighbors, not to give anyone power over anyone else. The changes made a real difference. Over the following months, Pinecrest Meadows felt different. People were friendlier. There were more block parties and neighborhood gatherings. Kids played in yards without parents worrying about someone complaining. During the next winter, when snow fell, people walked wherever they needed to in their yards, and no one said a word about it. I kept the original fine notice framed in my home office as a reminder. $200 for footprints in snow. It seemed absurd in retrospect, but it had uncovered something much larger. Patricia's obsessive need for control and her aggressive enforcement of petty rules had been symptoms of deeper corruption. My snow message had long since melted, but photos of it still circulated online occasionally. It had become a minor internet legend, a symbol of standing up to unreasonable authority. I got recognized sometimes at local coffee shops or the grocery store. People would ask if I was the footprint guy and want to hear the story. I always told them the same thing. It started with something ridiculous, a fine for walking in my own yard during winter, but it ended up exposing years of theft and abuse of power. Sometimes the small injustices are connected to bigger problems, and speaking up matters, even when it seems pointless at the time. The following winter, on the anniversary of the original fine, we got another significant snowfall. I looked out at my front yard, covered in pristine white snow, and smiled. Then I bundled up, went outside and deliberately walked in elaborate, random patterns all across my lawn. No message this time, just footprints for the sake of footprints. Marcus saw me from his window and came out to join me. Then Jennifer. Soon, a dozen neighbors were walking around their snow-covered yards, creating chaotic patterns of footprints and laughing. Someone brought out hot chocolate. Kids started making snow angels. It was not a protest anymore. It was just neighbors enjoying their property without fear, the way it should have been all along. The way it should always be. The sun set over the mountains to the west, painting the snow in shades of pink and gold. I stood in my yard, surrounded by footprints and friends, and felt genuinely grateful for the absurd find that had started this whole journey. Patricia's attempt to control something as harmless as footprints in snow had ultimately freed the entire community from her grip. Sometimes the most ridiculous battles lead to the most important victories. And sometimes, when someone tries to fine you for walking in your own yard, the best response is to walk even more boldly. Write your truth in the snow, and let the chips fall where they may. The HOA drama was over, but the community it had created was just beginning. And my front yard, with its proud history of controversial footprints, would always be a reminder that standing up to petty tyranny, no matter how small, is always worth it. Frank served 2 more years as board president before passing the role to Helen, who proved equally competent and reasonable. The HOA became what it was supposed to be, a simple organization handling practical matters like snow removal on common roads and maintaining the community center. No more arbitrary fines, no more harassment, no more drama. I ran into Patricia's husband, Gerald, at a hardware store about a year after her sentencing. He looked exhausted and defeated. He was selling their house and moving to a smaller place. Patricia was still in prison, with several more years left on her sentence. He apologized to me, even though he had never been involved in any of it. "I did not know what she was doing," he said quietly. "Not the stealing, not the extent of how she was treating people. I knew she took the HOA seriously, but I thought she was just trying to keep the neighborhood nice. I am sorry she put you and everyone else through all that." I told him I appreciated it, and I did. He was a victim of her actions too, in his own way. His life had been destroyed by her choices. As I drove home that day, I thought about how a simple fine for footprints in snow had unraveled an entire criminal enterprise. If Patricia had not been so aggressive, so unreasonable, so determined to exert control over every tiny aspect of neighborhood life, she might have gotten away with her embezzlement for years longer. But her need to dominate had been her undoing. My footprints in that snow had spelled out more truth than I had even realized at the time. The HOA was fining people for footprints, the board was breaking its own rules, and the president was retaliating against anyone who questioned her. But beneath all of that was theft, fraud, and corruption. My protest had pulled the thread that unraveled everything. Years later, when I eventually sold my house in Pinecrest Meadows to move closer to my job in Denver, the new owners asked about the framed fine notice on my office wall. I told them the whole story, and they laughed in disbelief. That actually happened. The news stories were all real. Every word, I confirmed. This neighborhood has a pretty wild history, but it is a good place now. The HOA is normal. The people are friendly. Just, feel free to walk wherever you want in your yard when it snows. They bought the house, frame and all. They wanted the fine notice as a piece of neighborhood history. I moved to a condo in Denver with no HOA at all. After everything that had happened, I wanted the simplicity of a place where I answered to no one about my property choices. It was smaller, but it was mine, completely and without qualification. But I never forgot the lesson of those footprints in the snow. When someone tries to control you over something absurd, it is worth pushing back. When authority is abused, it is worth exposing. And when you have the opportunity to speak truth to power, even if it is just by walking in a very specific pattern through your snow-covered yard, sometimes that is exactly what you should do. The case of the footprint finds became something of a legend in Boulder. It was referenced in news articles about HOA reform. It came up in discussions about homeowners' rights. A state legislator even cited it when proposing new laws to limit HOA authority and increase financial oversight. Patricia Hendricks became a cautionary tale, a reminder of what happens when people get a small amount of power and let it corrupt them. Her name was permanently associated with petty tyranny and criminal corruption, all because she could not let people walk in their own yards without punishment. And me? I was just Connor Yates, the guy who wrote a message in the snow and accidentally uncovered a major embezzlement scheme. Not bad for someone who just wanted to walk from his front door to his mailbox without getting fined. The story had a proper ending, with justice served and a community healed. But the real victory was simpler than that. It was every person in Pinecrest Meadows who now walked through their snowy yards without fear. It was every homeowner who knew their HOA fees were going to legitimate purposes. It was every neighbor who felt safe questioning authority without worrying about retaliation. That was worth all the hassle, all the stress, all the legal fees and public attention. That was worth making a fool of myself walking elaborate patterns in the snow to spell out accusations against my HOA president. Because in the end, everyone deserves to walk freely in their own yard, leave footprints in their own snow, and live without fear of petty tyrants who think a title gives them unlimited power over others. That is what I fought for, and that is what we won. And on snowy days, wherever I am, I still make a point of walking deliberately through every bit of snow I encounter. Not to make a statement anymore, but just because I can. Just because footprints in snow are natural, temporary, and harmless. Just because no one should ever be fined for the simple act of walking in winter. That is the real legacy of my battle with the Pinecrest Meadows HOA. Not the viral news stories or the criminal prosecution, but the freedom for everyone to walk through snow without fear. Sometimes the smallest freedoms are worth fighting for precisely because they are small. Because, if we let authority figures control even the smallest aspects of our lives without pushback, where does it end? It ends with people like Patricia Hendricks, drunk on tiny amounts of power, stealing from their neighbors while fining them for footprints. It ends with communities living in fear of their own governing bodies. It ends with the slow erosion of common sense and basic human dignity. But it does not have to end that way. Sometimes all it takes is one person willing to push back, to document the truth, to write their message in the snow for everyone to see. Sometimes one act of defiance can expose years of corruption. Sometimes fighting back against a stupid fine is about more than just the money. It is about refusing to accept unreasonable authority. It is about standing up for yourself and your neighbors. It is about saying no to petty tyrants who think they can control every aspect of your life. And sometimes, when the snow falls and covers your yard in white, the best thing you can do is walk right through it, leaving your mark, making your path, living your life without asking permission from anyone who thinks they have power over something as temporary and beautiful as footprints in fresh snow. That is my story. That is how I fought my HOA and won. And that is why, every winter, I will always walk freely through the snow, remembering the battle that started with an absurd fine and ended with justice served and freedom restored. The footprints fade when the snow melts, but the lesson remains. Never let anyone tell you that you cannot walk in your own yard, no matter what excuse they use. Some rules are made to be broken. Some authority is made to be questioned. And some fights, no matter how small they start, are worth fighting all the way to the end.